2013 of the Ordinance Committee of the City of Santa Barbara. Ms. Wong, would you call the roll, please? Here? Here. Okay, very good. And Ms. Baker, you want to lead us off and get us started? We're starting a big conversation today, aren't we?
Yes, yeah. It'll take a couple meetings probably. So good afternoon, Chair House and members of the Ordinance Committee. Today we are beginning our conversation on Historic Resource Ordinance amendments. And so the recommendation is that we would look at a general proposal to amend Chapter 2222, the Historic Structures Ordinance, and then also to potentially create a new chapter where we would move Historic Landmarks Commission information into that new chapter to have a more organized ordinance and help with our 5-year historic work program. And so a little background as to how this would do that. In October 2012, Council adopted Historic Resources element, and in that element, there's 47 possible implementation items to be considered. What we did is we visited council, the full council where you were in attendance in February, and we were directed to implement a work program to implement the HRE, I'll call it for short, the Historic Resources element. And the first item on the to-do list in that 5-year work program was to visit your ordinance committee to begin these discussions today. So on the to-do list in that work program for the ordinance committee are these 3 things. The first is possible historic and special design districts ordinance, which we'll mainly be discussing today. And then once we have this ordinance in place, it'll be more organized and easier for us to implement historic districts implementation using existing city historic survey data. And I'll go over what some of those districts are that we're potentially looking at bringing to you for consideration. And then the third item as part of the work program, which we would do later, is particular zoning amendments to support individual structures, historic preservation. So it could be just tweaks to different, say, residential zoning districts and so forth, and maybe changes to our modification processes and so forth. But that would be a bit later in the work program. We want to get these first 2 items done first. So the third one we won't really be going over today, and we'll be focusing in on the first item with just an introduction on the second one.
Excuse me, could you, Ms. Wong, could you turn the lights off over there by the screen? There we go. Thank you.
Okay, so as far as the big picture as to what these ordinance amendments are designed to support, as far as having the Historic District series of implementation program, first off, this year the El Encanto district is coming in, and that's just a item that needs to be done immediately, and that will be under our current regulatory framework. But then using our existing survey data, which is important to use because the city has invested quite a bit in gathering this data, and there is a need for historic preservation for these districts in an organized way. We would start with West Beach because the data there is the oldest. And then second would be the West Downtown, and within West Downtown there's actually 2 sub-areas that could be considered for separate districting. And then the next would be Lower Riviera or Bungalow Haven area. So those are the 3 top priorities as far as our existing survey data and getting those looked at and considered and mapped and implemented within an ordinance. Then after that, there is interest in some of these other areas listed, and as to which would come first, it would basically be dependent upon community interest and the survey data that would be needed for these. So that kind of gives you an overview of what would be coming down the road. Also, while we're on the topic of historic districts, there are a couple cleanup items that staff would like to see addressed. One is regarding El Pueblo Viejo design district. Of course, this is one of our major design districts in town. However, it's not a historic district specifically. It's more of a special design district that the Historic Landmarks Commission obviously does quite a lot of review work in. But we would like to, within that large district, set aside certain areas that are actually historic district with boundaries acknowledging that, where there's concentrations of historic resources. So that's a cleanup item that wouldn't be part of the immediate drafting of the ordinance, but it would come later. And then also, Brinkerhoff Landmark District would actually be more appropriately named historic district, so that could be part of our cleanup effort when we reorganize the ordinance. Okay, so in considering creating a new chapter and better accommodating historic districts within our existing ordinance, it helps to start and look at where we're at. And with Chapter 2222, you can see that it covers these topics, how to do historic resource surveys, demolition review procedures, and then designation procedures for structures of merits or landmarks, how they go through the process from HLC on up to council for designation. And then also it lists our current landmark districts, El Pueblo, Viejo, Brinkerhoff, and Riviera. And then also in here is all of the Historic Landmarks Commission procedures, which there are quite a bit. And everything to do with EPV, it is also a little bit comprehensive too. So there's a lot for this one chapter, and the thought was that what we could do is just move the El Pueblo Viejo portion and the HLC procedures into a new chapter. So you would see that those would come down here to 2267. They would just simply move. And then within 2222, first we would rename it to be a little bit broader of a term of resources versus structures. During the Historic Resources Element Update process, it was found that this is the preferred term when addressing historic resources, is resources versus structures, because structures is actually a little bit narrower than the term resources, and we want to address all the types of historic resources within this chapter. Make that clear. So we would add some new historic district formation procedures and individual project processing regulations. And those are what we'd like to talk with you about today as to what the basics of those would be so that the city attorney's office can go and draft something for your consideration. So then over time, once that's in place, we would have it set up in a way where the each individual historic district, as it was ready for consideration, could then be individually adopted and added easily to the end of the chapter, for example. Because right now they're kind of in the middle, and so we would just make it easier to have a more organized adoption process. So that's a summary of the changes. And then what we would like to do is go ahead and have an item-by-item discussion, perhaps after just a general taking of questions from the ordinance committee as to, the overall game plan for the discussion today and next time. And then perhaps we could discuss each of these items individually. We put the discussion items into attachment for you, and there's a new copy that I think you got today that's formatted a little bit easier to read. So anyhow, the attachment one questions are just basically, does it sound like a good idea to amend Chapter 2022 and create a new Chapter 2267 as we've outlined, just some confirmation of that. Second, what types of general historic districts formation procedures would we like to have? Three, what kind of trigger for HLC review, just an acknowledgement that that would make sense within historic districts to have HLC review at some level. And then fourth, what would be good criteria to have for special design district buffer area designations? Just should we have those included? And then fifth would be establishing administrative staff review criteria for minor projects. Not that we would be doing that today, but just acknowledging, yes, it makes sense to do that some point down the road, that this is the basic ingredients that we're going to have. And then we can work out the details of those later. For discussion item 2, this would be led by Nicole Hernandez, our urban historian. And this does get a little bit more specific. And there's a chart that goes with these questions too, where you can see that we've outlined how other jurisdictions have handled these items, who may initiate potential historic district designations, the criteria to determine their boundaries, and whether property owner approval percentages are advisable or necessary, and some natural disaster provisions. So again, we've got today and next time to discuss these items, and so hopefully that'll be enough time with the 2 meetings. And then with the budget financial information, you may recall that at the council hearing, $30,000 allocation was proposed for some items that have to do with the 5-year work program, and our work with you would be supported by this. And this will be considered as part of the fiscal year 14-15 plan in the Community Development Department's budget. So it's not finalized, but it's in the works. Okay, so again, back to the recommendation is just to go ahead and start discussing the items. And so I guess I'll turn it back to council. If you have questions at this point, or if you'd like to take public comment, and then we could start in on the discussion items more specifically, perhaps.
Okay, now at this point, I don't have any speaker slips for public comment, and if there's anyone in the audience who would like to speak, certainly I'll ask Fermina, Ms. Murray. As a member of HLC, I'd like to just have you come up and just take a moment with us if you're willing. Would you do that now? Okay, just come on up. As a member of the Historic Landmarks Commission, I would love to hear what you have to say. And then others who would like to speak to us, if you fill out a slip and turn it in over here to Ms. Wan. Hello.
Yes, good afternoon, Chair and members of the Ordinance Committee. I'm happy to be here to represent the HLC. And the HLC's work, as you know, we are your appointed body to implement all that you have mandated. I was reviewing all the staff has done a great work, so they will go over that. And we did look at some of the public comments and letters that came in. And I would just like to assure the Ordinance Committee and the public that these guidelines, this element, they are here to protect those individual and collective property rights. I could talk about various examples of how this works, but the intent of the city, and I think the element is really looking in the individual as well as the collective city, and how we maintain our character, how we stay within the goals that we have set, like a small town community feel, that you as anyone who lives, let's say, in the Bungalow Haven area, what is that about? It's the value of that. There are values of living in that neighborhood that are beyond monetary values. For example, and this is how preservation looks at things, is that you are in a bungalow, your entire sense of property value is related to the fact that you are within a walking distance to the courthouse, to the finest elements of the city. You are in that neighborhood. You are next to the 2 of the best schools. So school factors, the theater, the county bowl, the mission. These are the overall Santa Barbara community character that you belong to, and that enhances the power of your property. And so the city, when I see these laws and guidelines and all what we're going through, are just a tremendous effort to really protect that individual right of the property owner. Not just this property owner, but future property owners as well, and the overall character of our city, and balancing all those goals that make this entire city the most desirable place, the most, we are all here because we love it and want to protect it. And so that's how really the overall sort of philosophy of governing our efforts. So, but all this work is really your mandate. You have adopted this. We are just, appointed bodies to implement. And as you go through these conversations and we take in all what needs to be done, we are there to be helping the public. Now, the outreach programs are going to be huge. And it's already mentioned in the staff report how that will be. So there's not going to be any ignorance or anything on how this process will go. And that we prize that at the HLC. The HLC has made a commitment to be at those outreach meetings, at all of them, and to be there for the public, and not to advise them or anything, but to listen and to see how we could all work together. So that's where we are. And if there are any further questions, specific or general, I'd be happy to answer.
Great. And thank you for those reassurances. And we do have a question. Mr. Rouse has
Thank you,
something.
Mr. Chair. I'm glad to have you mentioned the outreach part of the issue. That's important. You brought up a point that is also going to be probably a hot button as well, is proximity. So, for example, the Bungalow Haven and how it's bordered and how it's defined, and then we'll have to just determine adjacency and what that means and how that's affected. Do you have any ideas on currently, for example, the Bungalow Haven? What could happen across the street from that, or would that have a definition as well? Can you help me out with that a little bit?
Yes. In the Bungalow Haven, in my understanding, is there's been a survey and there's been an identified core, not the entire area, but there's been an identified area where you have a potential historic district. In other words, majority of those buildings are what are contributing. Now, outside of that boundaries is the whole entire area. And so you look at all of what is the architectural style of that area? What is the scale? What is the streetscape? What is you look at all around elements of that area, not just one. And then you make that a project comes forward, we look at all that context, the historical context, the boundary context, the age, all those things, and then you determine, and then you're bounded by the guidelines to see how that work. What is good about what's going on is when you have architectural guidelines, it really guides people to know what they can do. And those guidelines make everybody rest, because when you make a plan for your house, you are within some good, wise advice is really what it is. And so it will devalue a bungalow to allow something to have, plastic windows next door. That will take down the value of that next door house. It's not a simple answer, and that's why we always adhere to that quality of what that neighborhood character is. And you look now at the St. Francis Hospital and the new buildings there. If you look around there, surrounding that property, the style is craftsman, instead of the colonial revival style, because they wanted to adhere to that, the compatibility with the rest, the bungalow. This is the kind of wisdom that has been going on, and that's why I have no fear. You're taking my rights away, or no, we are not. Nobody is taking your rights away. If anything, we are enhancing your rights. We're enhancing not just your particular property, but all around you. Nothing is going to be devalued. And I think that's what I see personally, as well as being a member of the commission. Many times we hear people come to the commission, they don't like us the way we're rigorous. But how many times we've heard that people go and said, I have a better project. And there's one example of a house, a Victorian wood house right on Chapala. And, they were going to tear that down, come in, say, no, please, why don't you retain the front? You can add all you want in the back, but be in scale with the rest of the neighborhood. It is a great project. That project is going to have 2 apartments in the back, a garage, all is there. It's just a matter of working together. And anyway, that's. I hope I have answered your question.
Oh, there you did. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, now don't go away, because I think Mr. Hotchkiss wants to talk to you.
Thank you. Chair, yes, I do. Did HLC take a position on whether people that live in a district should have a power of approval or disapproval as a formation of a new
No. Usually, it's a process that the city goes through, and we are mandated by our ordinance, our current ordinances, and so that was what we're following is really the mandate of the historic resources element and the general plan. That's how we see it. There's no sort of pre-approval of anything. This is the work process that is here. And as we look through it and work through it, but I think those questions could be, the outreach is so important because there's a lot of misconceptions and about what a district will be, how you would be in the district or not be in the district, what are the advantages, disadvantages. And, you know, when we look at it, we are looking what is in front of us and what is ahead of us and what is all in the rest of the elements. Not, balancing parks, traffic, all those things come into play. So it's not a simple answer. When someone, like all the communication has gone out to people telling them about, let's say, the West Beach or things coming up. But I think the staff will go through what triggers, how do you determine, something is going to be designated or going to be a district. I think they will go through that way better than I could.
So HLC didn't take a position?
No, we are not. We have not taken a clear, but we are just supporting what the staff is coming through. And
I understand.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Now, we'll just, if with your permission, members of the commission, we'll go to the one public comment that we have, who is from a previous historian for the city of Santa Barbara, and that's Mary Louise Days. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mary Louise Days, a retired assistant planner with the city, and as usual, I went through this and made comments, so my comments reflect these pages if you have them in front of you. And I speak from many years of experience of interpreting and implementing city ordinances and writing a few of them and working with the city attorney on them. And I agree with most of Ms. Murray's comments, especially about protecting districts. The purpose of an historic district is recognition and protection, and the staff and the task force want to proceed with some of those. The one it's actually more of a historic district, the Brinkerhoff Landmark District. I think we did that in 1982, and it was called a landmark district because that's all the ordinance provided for at that time. And it is to recognize the Victorian styles of architecture there, and also to say that the neighborhood should be preserved, and we later designated most of those buildings. And I believe that's the kind of thing that the historic district idea, and many of them would be small. El Pueblo Viejo is a called landmark district, but it is an architectural control district, and we were allowed to create that way back because there was state law created to permit municipalities to control architecture designs near historic buildings, especially very important historic buildings. On page 2, the background, there's a reference to historic resources element in the first paragraph, and also a reference to allowing the use of the historical building code.
Just for whomever's watching, this is page 2 of the staff report for our meeting today.
Yeah. The historical building code, the state historical building code, has been available to us since its adoption, and the building official is supposed to consider it when requested to. And it's certainly something that should be used frequently. On page 3, listing some of these future districts, which you did see on the screen, historical information is already available for most of them. So the time required to prepare the historical background would not be as long as might be feared. West Beach and West Downtown, those were covered in the Phase 1 architectural survey back at around in the 1970s, and some of them were added to. Lower Riviera District has already been created with a different name. And then at the bottom of the page, Diana Lane would not be too difficult. East Cabrillo Boulevard, again, was part of Phase 1, and I've worked considerably on Plaza Rubio and Plaza Bonita, so you wouldn't necessarily have to hire a private consultant to write those fresh, is what I'm saying. The staff could work with those. And Rosemary Lane, I believe, has been done recently. So on page 5, I caution you about writing a new chapter which would include El Pueblo Viejo, because we don't want to conflict with the city charter and other ordinance sections that refer to 22.22. If you're putting El Pueblo Viejo in a new 22.67, there really needs to be a lot of cross-reference there so that there's no confusion about the applicability of them. I see no problem with changing the Brinkerhoff Avenue Landmark District to Brinkerhoff Avenue Historic District and the procedure for that, and I've mentioned that earlier. I feel that there should be cross-references about the different demolition prohibitions. The El Pueblo Viejo language has very strong language about demolitions are not allowed without the approval of the Historic Landmarks Commission. I don't know what these other districts or what the new 2222 would say, but let's make it easier for the public to read what each district provides, but not to forget the larger El Pueblo Viejo Architectural Control District and its strong requirements. We don't want confusion in staff or public, and I've already seen some confusion taking place. Your discussion items on your attachment. I've already mentioned cross-referencing the language of El Pueblo Viejo. Guidelines publication would have to be reworded if you're changing chapter names. Each district ordinance should stipulate its purpose and its requirements. In other words, is the main purpose to protect a certain percentage of the buildings and to clarify about non-contributing buildings? Then that should be said. Is the purpose to designate or declare historic those contributing buildings? Then that should be very clear. I think that you should put the words El Pueblo Viejo District in the name of 2267 if it's created, again, to make it easier for the public. And 2B, significance criteria for a historic district establishment would be consistent with national standards. Well, let's also say that we want it to be consistent with Santa Barbara's standards. We were a sort of founding community for preservation in California, and we do not have to follow what other communities do in lockstep if we've gone beyond that and we have other language to apply. I caution under number 3 at the bottom of page 7, it says certain projects on property located within a historic district boundary would be referred to the HLC, and there's language about the staff giving administrative approval to some of them. I ask that whatever that language is be come really from the HLC, and that the commission review any suggested language for that, because it really should be only minor items that go before a staff administrative review, because of the notice desirability, and also in many cases maybe perhaps the commission would have taken different action. Number 4, special design district buffer area designations. This calls for buffer properties to be reviewed by the Architecture Board of Review or the Single Family Design Board, and that is a good recommendation. But of course, the language should state only if outside El Pueblo Viejo, because if there would be some sub-districts in there, and perhaps a Victorian district adjacent to El Pueblo Viejo, we can't have confusion with some of the one commission's jurisdiction being given to another just through careless language. Let's see. And under number 5, the administrative staff review for minor projects, I'm wondering if there would be an appeal process for that. Under discussion item 2, the term Historic Resources Survey, HRS, is used quite a bit, and of course the city has already done some of those. I'm wondering if there would be a definition for that and clarification about who carries them out, because most of them have been carried out by the city and either staff or consultants. And of course, clarification of the language about a public originated large study area. It says local resident could file a nomination application, and then under item at C, it says any public person. So I'm just wondering which is which. And on page 10, number 2, criteria to determine district boundaries, we might have additional Santa Barbara related criteria, such as our main architectural style, compatibility, and that kind of thing.
Ms. Days, would you be able to make a copy of your list of, I've made notes in my book, but they're on each page, and maybe if you could provide our staff with a copy of your list of comments. Is that possible?
I'll try. I can't do it very immediately.
No, it doesn't have to be right away. We're just starting our
conversation. I couldn't do it last night either. But
sure.
And then add reference to El Pueblo Viejo.
Mm-hmm.
And so I agree with the staff's recommendation about the owner notification and special design district criteria might be confirmed by the HLC. And of course, natural disaster provisions, I'm glad to see that in here, because of course we should use very, very cautious language and have very strict language, thinking of what Fillmore did in the last big earthquake, where they allowed their staff to go in and tear down buildings without really reviewing whether they could be repaired and how important they were to the community. That's so important to have that kind of coverage. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for your thoroughness. I think Mr. Hotchkiss had a question for you, Mayor.
I do indeed. thank you for getting down in the weeds here. Staff, did you follow all of what you were saying? I saw you taking notes like mad. Did you have any strong feelings one way or the other about the advisability of owner approval within a design district or historic district?
Only really from my experience of in the past, we've worked with the owners, and in some cases the owners asked for it. Like with Brinkerhoff, they asked for it. I think it probably depends on the size. If you're looking at a small one, like one street, 2 blocks or 3 blocks that has all very similar architecture, I think those owners would understand why it could be desirable to have a district. Communication really is the most important thing with that. I think without saying right at the start yes or no, I think it's educating them, it's answering their questions, it's being honest with them, it's having meetings. It puts an additional note on the property. It's not necessarily put in a deed restriction, but it does affect possible changes to the property, mostly with design, sometimes with preservation. But our landmark status is the only true preservation that we have in any of our ordinances, as far as demolitions are not allowed to be requested for a designated landmark. So I think that kind of thing would have to be explained too, that a district isn't necessarily the same thing. But it can cause problems to require 100% approval in a district, because some of them just might not go anywhere, because you may have someone for their own reasons that don't want it. So I think we'd have to just kind of move that along carefully and go from what the staff is recommending, but not letting us, not falling by the wayside with communication.
Well, I agree 100% would be impossible. That would give somebody a black ball that wouldn't be fair. But would majority approval seem to be desirable or not? Staff has recommended not, consistent with what other cities have done. So I'm just trying to feel that out, because if I lived in one of these districts, I mean, I might agree with the idea, but also be concerned that I didn't have some obligatory say in it.
I think that it would be a shame to stop the process, as you say. The best part, I think, would be for you as that property owner to keep asking questions about it. It could end up with the border being changed, because of someone's feelings. But and I'm sure the staff will inquire further of these other communities to see if there have been problems caused by their non-approval provisions. I think we really that needs to be looked into.
Thank you. So could we address that later when we get to the staff? Thank you very much.
Okay, very good. So we'll close the public comment period now. And I want to say that this is the kind of dialogue, and the beginning, of course, today we're not resolving stuff very much. We're more putting questions up for staff to be looking into and giving guidance if there's any process orientation issues or questions that will need to be answered. We're not going to try to resolve them today, but we want to make sure staff has a heads up on anything we at the Ordinance Committee see that we would like them to dig into. And we will be meeting on this again next week and continuing the conversation before it goes off to the HLC and the others. So do either of you want to start off with just questions or comments that you want staff to be alerted to, or issues you want to be sure that they address as they move forward? Okay, very good. Mr. Hotchkiss, why don't you start us off?
Thank you, sir. Well, you already heard my concern, and I'm sure you had the concern also, because you gave us 3 choices of whether it would be a minimum 51% simple majority approval, or 60 to 75%, or none. So I'm not sure where we go with that. I would like to hear historically what's happened in places. And one of the things that's of real interest, and maybe you can answer me now, is let's say that and a district is established, and then a home is destroyed. And so if it's a home that fits stylistically in with what the district was, what are the options of the owner? Or if it's a home, and there are sometimes, let's say, a modern home in the middle of a bungalow district that exists now, if that home is destroyed, what is something grandfathered in that looked like originally what the house did, or must they now conform with the district? Or am I getting ahead of us here? Who wants to handle that one?
I can answer that. We have drafted some of the guideline chapters. So for when you're talking about if a home is destroyed, we have drafted how new infill would go into a district, and it's just a draft, and the commission has not looked at it, but it's based on collaborations of other communities and experience with infill design, and we base it on fitting, whether it's not really replicating what was there, because then you're sort of contriving a history that was lost, but the infill would need to still meet the setbacks, bulk, size of the rest of the district, so that you still have a cohesive sight line when you're going.
But stylistically, it wouldn't necessarily have to conform if it didn't originally conform?
That way, I think, does need to go to the Landmark Commission to discuss, because I think that's a community decision. Nationally, it usually doesn't have to conform stylistically, but needs to conform with rhythms of roof shapes and fenestrations and materials, so that there's a little room for creativity to come into with the new building, so that it's sort of a sign of the new time that it was built, and not sort of something that people can't tell if it was original or not. But that I think the commission and the community need to be a little more, decide if that they want to follow those national standards or want to design something.
Yeah, I do think we need to look into that, because what exists now is one thing, but looking into the future, we could get in trouble if we don't do this right. So,
Right.
Anyway, that's one of my concerns. Just to let you know. Thank you.
And Mr. Hotchkiss and staff, maybe Betty, I think that what I would get out of that little exchange is this is one of the issues that needs to be discussed. You're getting a heads up from one of us on the Ordinance Committee, and that's we're going to make sure that those things are discussed at the appropriate levels. It'll then come back to Ordinance Committee before it ends up at City Council, if I understand the process correctly.
Yes, that's correct. The idea for this program is to have ordinances that establish the legal authority to establish districts, define their boundaries, the basic nuts and bolts of the district in terms of it's these properties, and certain properties are contributing resources in a district, and then other properties, like this example of a kind of 50s that doesn't fit in the bungalow area, that would be called out as a non-contributing resource. And then we'll have companion with the ordinance resolution and guidelines. And so as this work project evolves, staff will be proposing, working with the attorney on the draft ordinance, working with the HLC on the draft guidelines. And so this package will continue to grow and be in the draft proposed stage for quite some time for discussion on all these key points. And so as you are saying, you're making sure that this project, I'm calling, pulling together the program as a project, have these components so that you and the public can discuss them.
Oh, good. That's
Yes.
what I was going to say.
Yeah, there's
You
really
and the
no
public, it's
decision
very important.
today on the specific regulation or specifically what a guideline will or won't allow in terms of architectural style. We're still in the drafting and the proposal stage for community discussion.
I'm probably not bringing anything new to mind, but I just wanted to be clear that that's going to be important.
But at the same time, what we're hoping for today is your initial take, not only on, yes, these are things we'd like you to look at, but in the event that you have a position that one way or the other, you favor more or think that it doesn't need to be included, that would be helpful. So as
Good.
It is very preliminary, but as much information as you want to give us, it would be helpful.
Great. Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was thinking about, the natural disaster provisions I know we're talking a lot about the design districts in residential areas, but also we have commercial areas as well where ongoing operations are happening in existing non-conforming buildings. So a building is partially, significantly, or a couple of buildings in a row are destroyed within a zone. And most of those businesses would carry interruption of business insurance that would have time limits on it. And I know that oftentimes the process for going through review for design, particularly if the design has to change because the building was existing non-conforming, that may be getting a bit in the weeds. I don't know, Mr. Wiley, is there something that, in terms of that type of thing, that you would have to have an appeal process or a hardship review process that might be able to expedite things in these cases?
Well, I think generally the subject of, a natural disaster and in a, design district we'll need to deal with carefully. And like the city has in the past with respect to homes destroyed in wildfires, we've reacted to create an expedited process and reacted to not necessarily enforce all the requirement to bring something up conforming to current codes, for example, setbacks and things like that. So I imagine as we work our way through this, we'll be looking at that sort of thing, and we'll be drafting so that it's as easy as possible for people to rebuild. But as I think we've discussed a bit, the critical question may come down to what if they're non-conforming as to design? Are we going to force them to totally redesign what they used to have? And, I think we'll just have to work our way through that.
Yeah, because I can see the desirability wanting to do that to have it fit back into the neighborhood, but the other side of the coin is it may not be feasible from a financial, commercial, or timeline standpoint. So I would assume that would be some part of the consideration as we go through and draft this language. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'll just make a few comments here, too, from what I've read so far. I think just in general, there's the way I'm reading this, there's maybe a way I'm reading public interest in this. I hear two kind of side-by-side conversations. And one of them was well articulated by the two speakers today, which is the protection of historic resources, the very important need to retain and enhance the quality character of the community at large, to ensure that the areas of our town that have very unique and characteristic features have the opportunity to be preserved for their specialness, and then to have processes that make it so it's really clear to everybody how you function in that kind of world. There's another perspective which finds that threatening, maybe to personal property, that the sense that they would feel like they would be asked to do something they didn't want to do with their home or with their, because others seem to think that they belong in a certain district, and there's some fear and concern about that. And then there's also those who are worried a little bit about, like in the EPV, where in sections of town which have been scheduled or in our general plan, or at least zoned, to be able to be the receiving site for new residential living opportunities, the whole idea of compact development, and that the historic district with buffers around each one of the historic resources would begin to actually crowd out the possibility of those using the more dense downtown area for those kinds of uses and those kinds of structures. So there's a fear or concern about this being a sort of a hedge against any future development. So I'm just putting those two out there. There's sort of a need to balance that kind of thing. How do you protect and really keep the character of a specific historic resource or an area or district, including perhaps the buffers that are nearby that we're talking about, and not miss the opportunities that have been identified as our focused intention in the general plan, and abridging the rights of the people who own properties that are near or adjacent. So I feel that tension. I think that's what we're going to be discussing a lot, and I really like. Fermina, thank you so much. Mary Louise, thank you very much, because I think you really gave us a good foundation of what this discussion is going to be like. Let me continue a little bit more here, Ms. Hotchkiss, and we'll let you jump in. In many of our areas of town that I think we might even identify or consider to be a historic district or have a special unique character, many of the properties are very dilapidated and really run down, partly because of the age of the structures, and the architecture is quaint, but it may not be very functional. And so there's issues I can see that we're going to need to deal with. How do we not stifle upgrades to the structures to bring them up to code and yet still retain the character? How do we continue to encourage people to maintain and keep up their properties and not stifle that for a fear that if they go across a certain threshold, somehow they kick in restrictions or additional costs that they may not be prepared to bear? Lots of the homes, even in the Bungalow Haven area, have had retrofits and they've had additions, and it still feels like Bungalow Haven, but somehow we've been able to make that work. The Laguna Cottages, for me, stands out as an example of something that challenged the neighborhood. But after all that process, interestingly, they built to the densities that were allowable by zoning, much more than it would have been if it just had been the simple bungalow-style single home on each lot. But they still managed to retain the character with the guidance of our design review boards. And the ultimate result, it seems like it's an enhancement. That's an important balance. So again, I'm going along a little bit, Betty, with your encouragement for us to, show concerns. It's really important that we continue to keep that balance and that flexibility somehow and still hold the line for the design, which brings up a big issue. And one of them is that this is about historic resources, and I like that shift to using the words historic resources. But I noticed that it's not just historic districts. We're talking about special design districts under the rubric of historic, and it's not really. I mean, that shows up not in the beginning where it talks about historic resources and special design districts. It shows up later, like just sort of given that we're talking about historic and special design districts as if they're somehow co-equal. I don't know. This is one of the things I don't have a good answer to. Maybe you can speak to it right now, but we do need to resolve that.
Yes, Chair House. I also have a concern about the special design district concept because, then we could get to the point where every square foot and mile of our community is, under some design review. We're practically there already. But the idea is that they do go hand in hand. For example, let's talk about the Bungalow Haven area. At present, the way we did that was we first created a special design district. We knew it was going to take time in order to, within that design district, define a smaller historic district. So what's worked so well in the bungalow area is you may have a buffer or larger area where a certain character is there, maybe more of a scattering of a few important buildings or sites, really good quality architecture, but not necessarily a concentration that would lend itself to a historic district, but it's right next door to a historic district. And therefore, you do the design, special design district like a buffer around the historic district so that the historic district isn't degraded by having really incompatible development next door. My feeling on the design district is that it is not one size fits all. Some of these historic districts in the community really are only 2 blocks, and the adjoining development is incompatible now, one might say. It's a very distinct architectural character. So maybe in that historic district, you don't need a buffer or special design district. I'm thinking, for example, in industrial areas or commercial areas, we already have ABR review for commercial projects in that area already. So it may not be necessary in each instance to have a special design district buffer around each historic district. But we did put that out, and we do see it as a companion piece. It's a buffering.
May I ask, Ms. Weiss, we and the council felt very strongly that there should be a historic element to the general plan.
Yes.
And under a historic element, do we speak to not really historic resources, but design resources? Are they in the same, I mean, it's almost like we're creating a whole new chapter, but was that, I sort of don't know if I saw that coming, you know, and then I'm looking at the need for the special review of certain areas, and it also seems like these things should be kind of special. I mean, it goes a little bit to, it's not every single neighborhood and all over the town has its own special district, or we would be conflicting with zoning, and, you know, like the potential zoning. Like if you're in a R2 or R3 or R4 zone, you might actually have a single-family dwelling, which and if that ever were sold, the person could do something different. So retaining that character of that particular single-family house would be inconsistent with the design idea for the community, that there'd be a higher density receiving site, right? So
This concept is in the general plan, both in the land use element and in the historic resources element. At one time, when we were in the early stages of Plan Santa Barbara, we had actually proposed a combined community design and historic resources element. And because, again, they're important concepts to work together, but at the same time, they are different.
okay, well, this is going to be one of those things, I guess, that gets sort of wrestled to the ground as it goes along.
Right.
But I'm bringing it up because I think it needs to be actually discussed out loud, as opposed to just assumed that, oh, well, we have these special design districts under the historic element, but they aren't really historic. They look a certain way.
Well, for example, I can tell you we have this special design district around the Mission, and it's not really clear why. The boundaries were adjusted in the 90s for ease of measurement, and so we've captured some of the Upper East neighborhood as a special design mission district, and it really doesn't, some of these homes, you know, can't even see the Mission from the home. So we do need to be very careful and intentional about what this design district is for.
Preserve the nexus and the reason. I think that one of the comments I heard was, and I wrote it down here, was to make sure it's very clear what the purpose of the district is. If that would be very helpful in then identifying consistency with the particular district. I also noticed that in here we talk about a simple regulatory process. And my notes were simple, but not necessarily easy. In other words, clear, really clear process. But these need to be accomplished, I think, because they do affect a lot of people in many ways. And so there's got to be that rigor to the process to make sure that it really is called for. Let's see, a few other comments real quick here.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, please.
If I could just jump in,
Mr. Wiley.
because I had some comments on that last exchange with Ms. Weiss. You know, in discussing this with staff, and actually this is something we've been aware of for years, and it's a big factor here why we're moving forward. One of the things we've realized that our ordinances in this area have just evolved in different ways, in different directions over the years. And one of the fundamental problems is we're miscommunicating on our terms. We use something like a landmark district or historic district or special, and it means different things to different people. And so one of our starting points, I think one of the next things we're going to turn to is precisely defining what we mean by these terms and how they will impact a property. And I think that's going to be particularly important for the public reaction to, you know, I don't know that the average homeowner knows right now what it would mean to be in a city special design district. And so we've got to define that in such a way where they can look at it and say, okay, I can understand that. And I do think of the, I guess we call it the Bungalow Haven district, because that's familiar to a lot of us. We've been here while it evolved. And I would suspect that you ask most people in that neighborhood, and they're going to say, you know, I'm fine with it. It works well. It hasn't negatively impacted me or my property. And I assume that when you referred to the Laguna Cottages, you were referring to that project at Laguna and Mitchell Torino.
Right.
And I think that's a perfect example of something that worked well. It probably predated the Bungalow Haven district.
It's sort of what kicked it off. It was seen as a
Exactly.
threat to the neighborhood, and the neighbors rose to the challenge and then identified the special character of their neighborhood, which was the beginning.
And I think some of us recall how that played out in front of the Planning Commission, and how that project ultimately, at least in my opinion, is very successful. It fits in very well. But that's the sort of thing when you talk about a design district, it's not going to prevent someone from assembling some parcels and redeveloping it necessarily. And so, it'll be important to really define those terms.
Good
well.
definitions. And then I see El Encanto Hotel Historic District is what you suggest is probably going to be really the first district, at least in here says the first district proposed for adoption by staff is the El Encanto Hotel Historic District. It would be adopted under the current regulations, et cetera. But it wasn't in the list of those who are proposed for adoption in the ordinance. So what am I missing there?
Yes, I'd like to clarify that. That will be coming to the council in June of this year. It's an agreement that the property owners had with the city as part of the whole redevelopment project that they've just completed. So it is coming under a simple ordinance approach, the way the Riviera campus across the street up on the Riviera campus is a small district, and we're coming through and we're doing the El Encanto in a very simplified way. It's one property under one ownership, so actually it doesn't bring up quite as many issues as what we're trying to address in this new ordinance. So we're saying that can come up just as an individual district and drop it into 2222 right now as it is today.
Okay, before all this is
Before
adopted
all
and
of this,
that.
yes.
Okay.
So when we say first, we mean it. We're working on it now, but it's really not first of this new program.
Well, and going along with our conversation here, I had thought that EPV was a historic district. And from these comments, I see that I've been wrong all along, which isn't uncommon, and that the comments about being very careful about not confusing any district, the requirements for any particular sub-district, if you will, or historic district within EPV, that's going to take some real care. I certainly can see that. Let's see, and there may be another thing here on my list. And then the use of the word buffer. We had a big discussion about this during the general plan, and that goes a little bit to that concern about how far away, if you have an area that's defined specifically as a historic district or a special design district, and then you've got a boundary around it, which is one of the things that's kind of called for in the national guidelines, but then suddenly you have another boundary around the boundary, where do you stop, kind of? And it's, sometimes it's important to have edges on your districts, as I understand it. And so that will be one of the things I'm sure you'll have to take up. But be very careful about the word buffer, because the idea of buffer for protection as if new development would somehow harm the existing development, it needs to be in character, maybe it needs to be compatible with or distinct from. Some people think that it needs to be distinct to retain historic character, and address it. So that area definitely needs some care. Now that I have all Mary Louise Days' notes all marked up on mine, I have to distinguish between our both. Let's see. And then, okay. I think that gets us, yes, please.
Yeah, I was just going to suggest, we were intending just to have general questions about the PowerPoint, and then to get into the specifics of the attachments 1 and 2 one by one for an efficient discussion.
Well, maybe when you look at like the historic, for instance, this national register criteria and whatever we have here locally, the two need to be blended, but to get it down to where we're not just referencing something that exists elsewhere, but that we put it in our own language into our own.
Yes, we'd love to collect your comments on each of the attachment discussion items one by one if possible. Maybe we could work towards switching over. Would that be
we can.
all right?
Oh, of course, we can go right now.
Unless you have more global comments that you want to.
Yes, Mr. Hotchkiss.
You asked Ms. Weiss about direction, and I don't know, maybe it's too early to say this, but I would think that the people of a city would be more encouraged or more supportive if we did a minimum 51% simple majority approval, if for no other reason than they would feel that the city would work harder, therefore, to do it right. Whether that's the case or not, I have no idea. I think you're doing a great job here. But only for that reason you could call it a psychological reason, but it just would make people part of the process. And I think that we would get a lot more than 51%. Anyway, I'd like to know what my colleagues think about that. Thank you.
Chair House, could we please wait to have the
By all means.
discussion item
That's
by
okay.
item?
We're,
Would that be okay?
we're just, you know,
Okay, yeah.
doing the best we can up here, and you can guide us now.
We'll go around and we'd like to just cover everything in
Sure,
a
go
certain
for it.
order, if that's okay.
Go for it.
Yeah, okay. So shall we switch to the attachments now to begin?
Yes,
the
we're on to
discussion
the
item?
attachments.
Okay, thank you so much. I just want to make sure we can get through it. Okay, so the first question we have is just, does it make sense to have two separate chapters to get us organized for historic districting? And so right now we've got chapter 2222. So maybe just the very first question, would it make sense to rename for historic structures ordinance to historic resource ordinance? Would that be amenable to the ordinance committee to rename it?
Ms. Baker, do you just want to ask right now? That's a pretty
Yeah,
straightforward
the
question.
idea is that we'll go through and make
The
a
idea of
decision on each
generalizing it to historic resources as opposed to, what was it, historic structures? No.
Yes, ordinance.
So how does the committee feel about that? Yeah, any objections? Okay, no objections up here for that.
That's easy. And then the second, or item 1 here, if we could consider if the HLC procedures and the El Pueblo Viejo procedures could be moved into a new chapter. Now, Mary Louise Days did mention her concern about cross-referencing with the charter, and of course, we would work closely with the city attorney's office to make sure that all those cross-references would be appropriate. If for some reason we ran into a roadblock and that's not possible, then we would look at this again for a different approach. But assuming that that can be done appropriately, would it make sense to move those two items, which are a bit lengthy and they're not specific to do with historic structures designation, districts designation, surveys, if those could be moved into a separate new chapter 2267?
Ms. Baker, let me just comment real quick, just to start off. So it may not, why would we create a new one for that instead of just keeping that there, making sure the preamble says that there are now two sections, and this is the one, and then there's a new one to follow, and just leave all the cross-referencing alone?
If we move the rest of 2222 to a new chapter, then all that cross-referencing for those items will also need to be looked at. Unfortunately, Jaime Limon, our senior planner for Design Review and Historic Preservation, can't be here today due to a family emergency. But he's looked at this for quite some time, and this was his instruction or his preference, but I think that staff is amenable to looking at it either way. So,
any strong opinions up here, Mr. Rouse?
Well, I would, since we could get into weeds language-wise, like to defer to the city attorney's opinion along with staff's and then come back to us. And
Mr. Hotchkiss?
Just a question. This really is a language cleanup and a procedural cleanup, but it doesn't really change anything? Or am I being too cavalier?
we're just basically trying to get organization. So just acknowledging that there's a lot in one chapter, and could we have two chapters is basically the question.
Okay,
Yeah.
not a big issue, but it looks like we're really looking for legal advice and support on that. A question I have, though, is this goes to that issue between of the historic districts and the special design districts. It really kind of needs to be addressed in clear, clean text somewhere, maybe as part of definitions or part of some sort of explanation, because a historic element, by the way, which is it? Anybody know? Is it an historic element or a historic element? I see it both ways. Okay. Anyway, when you figure that out, we'll be good. So, but really to have that explicated, okay, clearly said, needs to be done. Okay, so anything else on that? All right.
So, okay, so is our take from the ordinance committee on that one would be that if it makes sense, city attorneys, legally drafting wise, to get it organized this way, either keeping one chapter and moving whatever.
It's almost above our pay grade. It really needs to be at HLC and with the attorney and with you guys. So.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, I got to tell you, a lot of these questions are stuff that the city attorney's office is supposed to sort out.
Okay, thanks.
And it's hard, from my perspective, I would think for you, it's hard to decide these things in the abstract. We'll put together an ordinance that makes sense, that has the correct cross-references and doesn't violate the charter, and we can tell you that, and then you can look at the substance of the ordinance. So I think the question may be more the substantive changes. So.
I think, and really what we're looking for is just that direction for the attorney's office to draft this, so.
Well, clarity and why you're making the distinction between two chapters, that really is important, because otherwise it looks like, well, anyway, that's enough.
Yeah, we want a clear place for the historic districts to live, so that's basically the intent, so, yeah. Okay, so let's go on to item 2, and this is just simply, yes, would the ordinance committee support the attorney's office drafting new historic district formation procedures? Now, we know that there's going to be a lot of nuances as to what exactly those procedures will be, and you'll review those, but would you like to go ahead and start that process of having something written?
I'm just going to, once again, just sort of step in. There's historic districts formation procedures. Do you mean historic districts and special design districts formation procedures?
We're keeping that together as in this, yes, yeah.
And it needs to say it. Because what happens is, over and again, we talk about historic
And
districts,
we'll
and
go into
we're
the
assuming
details
that
of those.
then later we sort of assume that special districts are included. I think that the clarification of the historic districts and special design districts formation processes, I mean,
Yes, and
right?
we're going to go into detail on what the special design district criteria will be, how those should be established, so.
Okay. So do you, ordinance committee, how do you feel about going forward with getting new procedures for formations of these things? All right, we're good.
Okay, great. And then the third item, should there be a referral process for certain types of projects within historic districts to require HLC review? And then also separate guidelines for administrative review of minor projects, which of course there would be fully reviewed, all of these items, but just does that general approach make sense?
How does that really differ from what we do today? I mean,
No, it's just carrying forward what our current practices
okay.
would be. So, although it wouldn't necessarily be to the same level as certain each district will be handled slightly differently, but it's just saying there will be some provision for HLC review and some provision for administrative review. EPV is a bit extreme in that every external change is looked at. We're not envisioning that for all of the districts coming up, and so it'll be worked out district by district what level of review, but just that there would be some sort of referral mechanism.
well, once again, I think as the speakers pointed out, as long as it's clearly defined so that somebody isn't in the weeds the minute they walk in the community development door.
That should
Mr.
be
Hodgkins?
included. Okay.
Agreed.
Okay.
And, you know, this is going to keep going to these questions. We're talking about historic districts. We are just changing the name to historic resources
Yes.
from historic structures. Oh, are we talking about historic, the issue of forming districts is one thing. The issue of identifying a historic structure is another one. And so we're not proposing any changes to how we designate historic structures or resources or...
Yes, that is correct. The new chapter, whatever number it is, 22 or some other, that's called Historic Resources. Within that chapter, the designation process that as it exists today for landmarks and landmark protection, that would be within that chapter called Historic Resource. Okay. Also, that chapter would have information on historic districts because those are historic resources. The other chapter is more of a procedural El Pueblo Viejo design review process with the HLC information. So you're correct. We're going to block in and retain the landmark designation process, the structure of merit designation process, and we will have a section on historic districts.
Right now, there are historic resources in town that are not an EPV, anywhere around town, that HLC is triggered to have their review.
And that is in the ordinance. It's enabled by the municipal code, and it would remain in the municipal code, and it would be in the chapter titled Historic Resource, because that's what it is. It's a landmark off in upper states somewhere. It's not in El Pueblo Viejo, so it wouldn't go in the El Pueblo Viejo ordinance. It would go in the historic structures ordinance.
I think you've got a nod on that.
Yeah. This concept of the special design district that I know is of particular interest to you, it's not clear to me where that makes sense in the code. We did speak with Jaime, and all of us talked about that. For example, now, you know, the bungalow special design district is actually in the ABR ordinance. okay? Because ABR, and I think also in the single-family design review ordinance, because it's not part of El Pueblo Viejo, it's a design review, special design district. That is what the bungalow district is now. So again, depending on the nature of the newly created historic district, if it needs a buffer of a special design district, defining that district and who has authority in that district, it may or may not be HLC, for example. The question you just answered a minute ago, Heather asked, is it going to be HLC review of historic districts? And we all go yes. Well, that makes sense. It'll be a question as to a special design district around a buffer, and Mary Louise Days brought this up. She said, be clear that if a buffer around a historic district is in El Pueblo Viejo, well, then it's clear that it's HLC who would be reviewing in that buffer. So,
And would it be the same outside of EPV?
outside
that's
of
a pretty
EPV,
important question.
outside of EPV, it may be ABR, as it is today for the bungalow, is what I'm saying.
Well, then
The bungalow
this is something that will need to be discussed, not
Yes.
here right now, but as we go forward, as to whether, if you have a historic district that's not an EPV, whether that doesn't trigger HLC review as opposed to ABR review. And then any adjacent properties, are they still under ABR review with, the notice that it needs to be compatible with the historic, or does that also become HLC? It seems like that's a
Well,
big,
these are
a
the
big
two
question.
questions that we're on right now.
Yeah, but I
That's
don't know
what
that
que-
I
that's
don't
what
think
question.
I'm ready to answer that myself at this point.
Okay, well,
I mean, are you guys? I mean,
question number 3
Yeah.
was, let's say we all see these 2 blocks of Diana Lane, I'm just saying, for example, this neighborhood, and you go and you look at the homes and you could see they were built in the same time period with craftsmanship of stone, masonry, all this, it's like, here's Diana Lane. And you all would say, okay, city designates that as a historic district. It's this 1 block long, it's 8 homes, and I'm not accurate on this, I'm guessing, I can't remember. But HLC is going to review any changes to those 8 homes within this historic district. Even today, because they're on the potentials list, they are already being reviewed by HLC, okay?
okay.
However, across the street, not in the district, is a single-family home built by some other architect in some other time period. If they do a second story, that project goes to single-family design board. And what we will decide when we look at this district is that okay? Can the single-family homes across the street just stay with the current process, or is it important to draw a special design boundary across the street and say those homes are now in a special design district relative to the 8 homes, and the review will be at HLC? Or this is a special design district across the street from the 8 homes, and it's still going to be reviewed by the Single Family Design Board, but we have these additional 4 guidelines for them because they're across the street from a historic district. That's what we're talking about today, is that staff is already thinking in this ordinance in these terms. And they are both, as the attorney explained, structural, but they're also substantive. And so you as council saying, we want this advisory board to look at historic districts, and we are open to deciding if properties around it should also be reviewed by Historic Landmarks Commission or might be reviewed by one of our other bodies. And so those are questions 3 and 4 on attachment 1.
I certainly would want, and others may have opinions here, I'd want some advice from those who are practitioners in the field as to whether having that kind of special design district across the street, say from a row of historic homes, if that isn't a setup for objections and problems for that would be resistance to establishing a historic district. It seems to me like we want to facilitate and encourage historic districts where they're appropriate, but we don't want to create unnecessary opposition to that. So it would be really good to hear from practitioners in the field and know what works and what actually encourages us to meet our goals. Others have comments on that?
Well, just thinking the example you brought up, Ms. Weiss, about that about the building across the street, the single-family home across the street, but if that was zoned R2, that wouldn't even go through single-family design review. And so you'd have another layer that would be gone in terms of buffers. I remember we talked about buffers during the building that got approved on the corner of Olive and Cannon Perdido, because it was not in, but within a block of EPV, and should that matter? And I think that was a volleyball we batted back and forth for a while. So the buffer thing is still, and Mr. Wiley said something weird, he's like talking about these things in the abstract. You know, it's for somebody like myself, it's hard to grasp, you know, when we talk about these things in the abstract as opposed to laying out examples or a map or something we could look at and say, this is the result of what we just did. Is what is that going to affect? I mean, that would be helpful for me. I don't know.
Thank you. Mr. Hotchkiss.
Mr. Wiley, you have some thoughts on that?
Well, my only thought is, I was thinking back of that Olive Street appeal a few months ago, and the West Side appeals at Mission, and the tough ones are at the edges, at the buffers. And then you go, well, do we need a buffer on the buffer? You know, the easy ones are in the smack dab in the middle of something, and you say, you know, it's the guidelines and it's required. So, you know, my only thought is when we get into the drafting of this, the tough issues will be at the margins, at the buffers, and how we deal with people who aren't in an area, but we question whether we should have some sort of transitional design and some sort of buffer and how wide that is. So those are my only thoughts. And there's a lot of different things that we can do. I mean, one option here was to refer someone across the street to the HLC for their approval. Well, you could refer them to the HLC for comments as well. You could decide as a matter of policy that the ABR, and I think this is probably true, has a broader view of things than the HLC, and that maybe it's appropriate if you're not in a district that you remain with ABR, unless you're in maybe a single-family zone, something like that. But as you say, I think we need the actual ordinance language in front of us in draft, and then we can work through it.
It'll help a little. I think we have, I was reading here where in that national standards criteria, it says a district must be a definable geographic area that can be distinguished from surrounding properties by changes such as density, scale, type, age, style of sites, buildings, structures, and objects, or by documented differences in patterns of historic development or associations. I mean, this is where we really need help from those who do this stuff, because distinguishing a district or really making sure that a boundary is a boundary around a district is pretty important to the property owners that are nearby. And we could take something could be very clear and then muddle it like crazy and make it and lose the clarity, which is what we've been trying to achieve. All right, I don't know if that's helpful. Did that help at all?
Okay, so item number 1A4, over time, add new historic districts. And when I say this chapter, we were intending 2222, but again, to be determined as they are adopted. Also later as a cleanup item, adopt new historic districts within the existing EPV district. And again, it's just giving direction to the city attorney's office to create a framework for these to be an organized possibility in the ordinance. Is that okay?
Any comments? Yes,
Once
Mr.
again,
Ross.
I find myself lost in the abstract. We have about new historic districts within the EPV. I'm trying to think of what it is we're talking about. And,
Oh, right.
and what's
So-
We have to distinguish EPV as not a historic district. That's like that's going to be like number one on the list of things you teach people, because I don't think anybody thinks the red tile roof part of Santa Barbara isn't a historic district. Right. So we're going to need to really disabuse people of that notion if we're going to talk about historic districts inside EPV, because it'll seem just redundant.
Well, one thing that you might consider is there could be new names. So take, for example, the Presidio State Park. That could be a historic district with the name. And I'm sure Mary Lou is probably cringing at my making up of the name. But I'm saying it could be a name like Presidio State Park District, okay? It would no longer really be referred to as El Pueblo Viejo, okay? Or Brinkerhoff no one seems to have a problem when we call Brinkerhoff Brinkerhoff. Brinkerhoff is within, oh, okay. Well, pretend it was in. Pretend that it was right next door. Plaza Rubio. Okay, Plaza Rubio is in El Pueblo Viejo. Someday, when Plaza Rubio is a historic district, it will be called Plaza Rubio. No one is going to be thinking, well, is it an EPV? Because it will be Plaza Rubio. So I don't think it will be as difficult as you think, but I do agree with the chair that it's important that in this process people come to understand what a historic district is and what El Pueblo Viejo is. And so that will be a benefit.
And is like, for instance, in downtown Santa Barbara, we have a number of historic structures, and they could be seen as a historic resource, but they're historic structures. Does having a historic structure in a particular, on a street or near other things, make a district? Or does a historic structure, can it stand by itself, or does it by its necessity create a district around it? And I think that's an important distinction that needs to be made, because we have a number of wonderful examples of adobes and things like that here in town. Does the existence of a historic resource or structure suddenly make that that block or that block face or something a district that we have to acknowledge as a district? I see the HLC, Ms. Murray, shaking her head. No.
No.
But it would be a concern, I think, of a business community with a lot of historic resources, that suddenly the entire business center of town becomes a historic district just because there's a bunch of really important historic structures in it. So when you're talking about, as a cleanup, adopt new historic districts within existing EPV district, I will imagine or predict that there'll be some that will be concerned about that.
Yeah, I think it would be a collection of historic buildings together. So if you had a block or 2 or 3 block radius of historic building, and all together that is what would define it, not one building and every other building around it that didn't have the significance.
Okay,
It's
good.
2
Thank you.
different
I mean, I
things. Does that
remember
make
the
sense?
maps that we were shown
Yeah.
of downtown with circles around historic resources, and pretty soon it was a Swiss cheese with more holes than cheese.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what, I'm remembering that conversation. So this will be important. This needs to be really defined well.
So, Chair House, again, it's just creating the framework that this could be possible, and it would be very selective as to what would be an EPV in the future, which is what I think you're giving us direction to be selective when that's actually done. But it's just, again, can we have a framework for the historic districts to be added one by one into a chapter, and then creating the space where that if EPV Special Design District was to have historic districts within it, that there would be a space in the ordinance for that for the future. That's all we're asking, if the attorneys can
I
draft
think there's
a
no
framework.
big issue up here,
Okay.
again, based on legal.
Well, I was gonna ask one thing, is Mr. Chair,
I'm going in order. You
this
guys
may
go
be
in order.
maybe too volatile to do, but it's almost like when Ms. Weiss talked about the Plaza Rubio, that took it out of the abstract into the real. So I can envision that. And it's almost like if the survey data were available for this discussion that already exists, it would make it make it a lot easier for me to go, oh, that's what we're talking about. So.
I think next week when we get to attachment 2, which is more of the details of what would the standards be to create districts, I think we can bring the bungalow design district, or even portions of, was that the one I was looking at this morning, or West Beach? The concern is that we can show you these as examples for discussion, but we didn't want anyone to be confused thinking that you're actually designating West Beach next week or anything.
No, and I completely understand it, but it does help us with that cause and effect. If we do this, what did it do?
Right.
In real time. That was
Specific examples. Anytime you have a question, we could provide that today, and we'll do it next week with exhibits. I think will help you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hopefully this next one's pretty easy. It's just an efficiency improvement. Right now, when the potential historic resources list is updated by the HLC, the Master Environmental Assessment document is formally required to be amended. If you want to turn to your ordinance, you can see this, how it's written, but it just basically, it would be revising it so that the HLC can act on a potential historic resources list update without having this formal amendment to this other document, which is just cumbersome administratively, and then it delays the whole process of the designations happening efficiently. So,
Any
it's just
objections from my
a
colleagues here?
minor efficiency
None from me
improvement.
as well.
Mr. Chair, can I ask, I don't
Yes.
know, I'm not sure I follow this one, then how would a property owner find out if they've been listed or as a potential?
We follow the procedure. It is in the Chapter 22.
I
The problem
wasn't
is
In down the line, a new property owner, where would a member of the public find our list of potentials?
online very soon. We're working. That's one of our work program ideas, and it's on the HLC agenda tomorrow to update this list and make it accurate, up to date, and available to the public.
Okay, so why do we need to amend the MEA each time?
Well, that's the problem, is that we feel we don't need to amend the MEA, but there's a sentence in the municipal code that says you do.
Well, isn't it just an exhibit to the MEA?
Yes, it is.
All right, well, anyway, I'm not sure I support this, but we'll talk about
Okay.
it.
Well, perhaps one of the things that could be done, and again, just needs to be worked out, is that the MEA gets amended to refer to the list, the updated list. So if the MEA was, you need to consult this ongoingly updated list, and then that's the one amendment, and then after that, the list just keeps getting added to, something like that.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's much more cumbersome than that right now, so we'll simplify it is
All right.
the idea. So, okay. Item 1B, we talked about this already. So there's going to be a new chapter, and either the existing or the new chapter will cover HLC and EPV. And we talked about that we need a place for historic districts already. That was under 1A3, and then we've also delved into special design districts a bit. The thought was that it would be in a separate chapter from the historic districts. That at this point, staff is considering that the attorney's office will probably be drafting something where the special design districts land at a different section than the historic districts list, so that it's clear that there's clear differences between them.
And clear definitions, as Mr. Wiley said.
So, okay, so that makes sense for you to
Anything
have
there,
them
Mr.
separately.
Hotchkiss?
Is this actually a formation not only of an element, but a commission itself?
No. The Historic Landmarks Commission is already in place, and
All right.
so we're just changing where those procedures for the HLC are
All
put.
right, so we're not having HLC-2 here.
No.
Thank God.
However, Ms. Baker, special design districts are not all reviewed by HLC.
Right.
They're unless they have a historic piece to them, they would be under ABR or the single family.
We're just getting the direction that they would be separately addressed from the historic districts.
Well, my point is that this is going to be in a chapter about that has to deal with historic landmarks commissions' roles or functions, right?
Yeah.
And then you're dealing with special design districts, which aren't actually reviewed by HLC. So that needs to be worked out somewhere along the way.
Yeah, so we'll make a note that this item B2, 1B2 could very well end up being an ABR or SFDB, depending on what makes the most sense. So we'll strike that one and change that.
And it's not three chapters, like just the 2222 with this historic landmarks and special design removed, and then historic landmarks commission's purview, and then special design districts and who oversees that. It's not. You sure it's not three chapters altogether?
Well, if it's under ABR, it would probably be under ABR. If it's under SFDB, that special design district can go under SFDB, or the attorney's office may come up with a clever way for us to group them together somewhere. So we'll see what makes the most sense. But just
Okay.
the idea is that they're going to be listed separately than the historic districts themselves because they are different.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so then item 2, Betty's been whispering to me that we've already talked about 2 and 3, but I'm trying to go in order. So let's just double check that we did actually get through number 2 here. General historic district formation procedures, item A. The formation of the districts would emulate current landmark designation process, which involves the use of multiple public hearings and due process steps. I think we've heard from you that it's very important that we inform the public and have workshops and meetings and make sure that there's a lot of education. So is there agreement there? Yes? Okay.
Yep, in the absence of any dissent.
Okay, so then item 2B, significance criteria for historic district establishment would be consistent with national standards, which is your attachment 3.
Mr. Hodges?
Well, that's the one where it was said it should be modified to fit Santa Barbara, correct?
Right, okay. So was there any, just so that we're collecting, and that was, I think you were
I
starting
just don't want it to be
comment on that.
exclusively the national standards. We're going to
Right,
use
right.
that as a basis, but we got the Santa Barbara version.
So look to it as the attorney's office is drafting, but acknowledging that there may be some changes to make it specific for Santa Barbara. Okay, great. 2C, the ordinance.
Well, it's like, air quality. There's federal air quality standards, there's California air quality
Yes.
standards. California's stricter. So we're kind of like, based on the national standards, and Santa Barbara's are stricter. So we want to make sure that that's in there as well.
Right, right. Okay. So I think it's just good that we're knowing that there's not any huge problem that you're seeing with looking to this to start with, at least. So, and then we'll adjust as we go. Okay. So 2C, the ordinance may emulate appropriate formation procedures from other jurisdictions to be discussed separately, each of the items, because I know there may be some preferences on the committee for the specific items as to which way to go, but just that it's a good idea to look at what other jurisdictions are doing as it's
Any
being
objection
drafted.
there, gentlemen? Okay, we're good.
Okay, great. So number 3, HLC review. I think we have talked about this, that in the chapter that discusses historic districts, that within the historic districts, that's where the HLC referral would happen, as we do now.
Any issues with that? Okay.
Okay, so then number 4, this one. Okay, so that, again, we have started talking about this a bit, and I think it's one of the more difficult discussion topics. So it keeps jumping, so sorry, it's going to be halfway down the page. Special design district buffer area designations would be considered for properties in close proximity to historic districts. So we're just saying that can this be part of the process, is to have this consideration, and the special design district companion designation would serve primarily as buffer protection for the adjacent historic district. Alterations to special design district buffer properties would be reviewed by the ABR or the SFDB. And that review would ensure development is designed to be sensitive to the neighborhood context and does not negatively detract from the adjacent historic district. So the basic components are just that as historic districts are adopted, can there be some sort of framework within the ordinance that could consider the appropriateness of design districts or buffer areas for ABR and SFDB
And
review?
Mr. Rouse?
So would that necessarily change the parameters of single-family design review board? As in the example I brought up earlier, were there an R2 property next to an historic district? Would the single-family design review board then be part of the review process, as it is not now, I don't think?
The idea is not to complicate it and change that, so that if, for example, the surrounding area around a newly created historic district has R3 zoning, and someone is proposing a apartment building, that goes to ABR. If the zoning around a historic district is single family, then it usually would be that the project across the street would be reviewed by the single family board. And this would really be considered on a case-by-case basis, depending on the district, depending on its location, depending on what is around it, does it serve appropriately as a buffer. So as Heather said, we want to work with the attorney to establish an ordinance to consider these, not to develop them now, but this is just the ordinance enabling, this process.
Yeah, once again, it's hard to totally define and clarify it all, but
But the intent is not to, when we said SFDB, we didn't mean just by giving that as an example to change R2, none of that. That's not what we're talking about.
Right, thank you.
Hold on just a moment, Mr. Hodgkins. I just want to say, I think that there probably shouldn't be buffer areas. If you've got a district, include the buffer in the district. If you're going to require special review for something that's adjacent to a historic district, have it be part of the district as opposed to having it then be in this gray area, which causes confusion and has people wonder who's going to review what, and then we have to go through this whole process. If you really need a definable, I believe, at this point, we need to define what the boundaries of a district are. People within the district have special review. People outside of the district have the standard review, and that's just clear. If we have an area that you're concerned about, just make the district big enough to include those areas you're concerned about, or get smaller and really define the district more rigorously, and then let the other properties know they're going to get standard review, and this is going to get the historic review for good reasons. And that will drive the nexus. That'll make it really important that people who are concerned about the historic resource identify which properties, where the boundaries should be for special review, and then the other ones outside of that are going to be exempt from that special review. At least that's where I am right now with it. Certainly, after all the discussion, my point of view might change, but that's my starting point for clarity more than anything. Mr. Hotchkiss.
Thank you, sir. I agree clarity is important. I'm sure you do too, but sometimes it's hard to be clear. But let's take the Diana Lane area, because on the one side of the street you've got sort of, I don't know, Spanish Revival or something. On the other side you've got Delfonso homes and some other, I think, that don't fit at all. There's almost like a line in the street, in the middle of the street, where one works one way and one works the other. So let's say that I'm on the non-traditional side, the outside this line in the street, and I want to make a change to my house, and I go before the Single Family Design Review Board, I think. Do they take into consideration, hey, across the street is a certain element, or is that just they're blind to that? How does it work now?
Good question.
I think the way it works now is they do take into consideration neighborhood compatibility.
Okay.
And we asked for, survey of the closest homes. We asked architects to bring in photographs. And even in the ABR ordinance now, there is the statement, you're all remembering the Olive Street project, because there's a statement in the ABR ordinance that says, in close proximity to El Pueblo Viejo, or I think it may even say on lots adjacent to, consider this proximity to El Pueblo Viejo. So that already is something that all of our design review boards do.
So neighborhood
They look at the
compatibility.
context and compatibility now, yes.
Right. All right. So that wouldn't change. So what Mr. House is proposing is a line in the sand rather than just.
No, actually, no. Quite literally, ABR and the Single Family Design Review Board look at the surrounding homes, and they look at the area around, and they're looking for some kind of compatibility. But that's just part of the normal design review process. It doesn't mean they have to have to address a particular historic character, which is what you would retain in the design district itself. So I'm worried about having these buffer areas where we have this quasi-historic sort of extra layer of something. If it really is that seriously important, then my thought is that should be included in the district. That's all.
Yes, Chair House, we'd really like to discuss this more with you next week. When you look at the questions in attachment 2, which would be next week, this is really on point to the issue of how do you draw boundaries, what do you include in them, the concentration, and we will have visual exhibits to help your conversation. And as you say, your point of view or that option is a very valid one. I think that you'll want to explore it a little bit more next week as well.
Yeah, I'm not like none of us, I don't think, have our heels totally dug in any of this at this point. We're just
Nor
trying to
do we
get some.
really. We had a certain idea, and this is perfect. But I think it will lend itself for more discussion next week as well with exhibits.
Ms. Wan, should we, in the interest of time, I know we got one more, unless it's just super easy on the minor projects.
Well, I think probably the next one probably is easy, and so maybe we could
Okay,
just
we'll
agree
do
to
that
come
next.
back to number 4 after attachment 2 is done next week.
Okay.
And number 5, it was just, I think we've kind of, got touched on in earlier comments, but basically that, yes, we would have administrative criteria, that the attorney's office would draft the ordinance in a way that that's allowable for staff to do some of the minor reviews for efficiency, and then that there is this concept of certificate of appropriateness, but that basically it's just a term that we could bring into play in the ordinance to allow for approvals and building permits to be issued in an expedited manner, and that's something that the urban historian.
Is there an appeal
could do.
process? That was a question that came up.
We've sort of drafted how this would work in our, we have a draft of a lot of the chapters of the guidelines, and staff would pretty much be reviewing, if you wanted to restore your windows or you wanted to replace them to match existing. It's when things go beyond that it would go to the commission. And yes, if you did not agree with staff and you wanted to change out your windows, you would go to the commission. So anything that you disagreed with the staff, you would go to the commission and beyond.
Is
You
it
don't
possible
have
for
to.
someone who's in the neighborhood or somebody has a concern about that, can they appeal a decision like that? I just don't know.
Yeah, so if
Okay, it
your
goes either
neighbor
way,
wants, yeah, so they could come in. It would be a public process after.
Okay, good. Ms. Baker, what are we all good with this last one, number 5? And we can come back to 4 after some more discussion of attachment 2 next week.
Yes.
Ms. Baker, you want to preview what we're going to do next week?
Oh, sure. It's the next attachment 2, and so process for historic district designation initiation. Could it be city, public originated, and would it be different for large or small city areas? And what criteria would determine the district boundaries themselves? So it would obviously be very different for historic district boundary, which has the HLC review, versus a special design district boundary. So we'll look at that very closely. Property owner approval, which I know has been brought up today quite a bit, so we'll look at that closely. And natural disaster provisions, which also generated interest today.
Okay, very good. Then I'll also say to the public, and I thank the 2 who spoke today, really very helpful to us. If you have things that you haven't already commented about, you want to add to that, we'll open public comment period again next week. And others who have an interest in this are welcome to come. We'll meet at 12 o'clock next week as well. Yeah, so we have more time like we did today to really get into it. Thank you all very much. We're adjourned.
So much as well.